I think I need to be made a host to be able to share my screen.
Yes, wait a minute. Sorry, I forgot. There, done.
Great. Let me. All right.
Okay.
Can you see my screen? Yes.
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 Just
So I will make a brief introduction. Okay, and welcome to another JiLAEE seminar. I hope you all are doing well, and thank you for being here. We are very happy to have today Raissa Fabregas. She's an assistant professor of economics and public affairs at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. She holds a PhD in public policy from Harvard University, specializing in development and labor economics. She also received an MS in economics from development from the University of Oxford and a BA in economics from McGill University. Her research interests include understanding barriers to human capital accumulation and labor market access, evaluating interventions to improve public service delivery in developing countries, and the role of social preferences on economic outcomes. She has a very interesting article, and it is highly relevant for Latin America, which is connected with today's talk. The article was published in Science together with Michael Kremer and Frank Schilbach. And the article is about how to enhance the potential of digital development for the case of agricultural advice. I think that, again, is particularly relevant, and today we also will learn more about that very interesting problem. And she also have a paper that I didn't see, but I saw the title, with the very intriguing title, Netflix for Agriculture. So, but today, Raissa will be presenting a paper about digital information provision and behavior change, 6 experiments in East Africa. So thank you so much again, Raissa, for being here. And regarding the question, again, as usual, people can intervene at any time, asking questions directly to Raissa. So, well, thank you again, and it's all yours, the floor.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. And as Julio said, please sort of like, I don't know if I'm going to be seeing sort of hands, so feel free to sort of like just unmute yourself and interrupt me as we go along, sort of like normal style. Let me start just by thanking for inviting me to this talk. I sort of heard so much about this group. I sort of like heard different things from, you know, all good things about JiLAEE, and sort of like I'm pretty excited about sort of this initiative in Latin America. Today, I'm going to be presenting this paper that, as Julio said, is on digital information provision and behavior change. And as you'll see, it's not going to be on Latin America, but a lot of my current work is experimental, and it's based in Latin America. And so I'm hoping to sort of like make connections with some of you, because there might be sort of like overlapping themes that might be relevant for all of us. So this is work with Michael Kremer, Matt Lowes, Robert Ahn, and Julia Zane. And so let me start by sort of like motivating this paper by this idea that I think governments and different organizations, one type of policy that they really like implementing to try to change people's behaviors are informational policies, right? Sort of like these types of informational interventions. And that's because informational interventions are cheap. They're not you know, they're not super intensive. They don't require a lot. And as economists, we might think that, you know, we like these types of interventions because to a certain extent, we think that, you know, by giving more information to people, they're gonna update their beliefs and perhaps sort of like, choose behaviors that we think sort of they're closer to an optimum, right? And so something that has changed in the last 20 years in this space is just the massive adoption of mobile phones across low and middle income countries, right? And so if you sort of like see the data and sort of like just sort of what has happened in the last 20 years, you see that basically most people around the world are going to have a mobile phone. And that has really changed, right? Like what can be done in terms of trying to reach people and deliver information to them, right? So we've seen hundreds of different types of initiatives and lots of different settings, from health, education, finance, governance, agriculture. Only a few have been evaluated, but there's a lot of like interest, right, in trying to use digital interventions to try to reach people at scale. And something that's nice about sort of like mobile phones, perhaps different from like other technologies like radio or television, is that it has also the potential to personalize information, to target it to the right moment, et cetera, right? So I think there's sort of like this interest in sort of like trying to use this technology to sort of like try to achieve sort of like that potential of information sort of dissemination to people. Now, in this context, right, I think still for, developing countries, text messages are perhaps a very relevant technology, in part because the cost of transmitting sort of like a text message is incredibly cheap, right? So we're really talking about like cents on the dollar, right? So if you sort of like see what it costs to like do bulk text messaging to people in a country like Kenya or in India, it's like, like cents, like, I think we have these prices for like last year, right? Which is like 0.002 cents to send one message. And the other reason, right, is that in a lot of the world, like smartphone adoption is not that common, right? So most people have sort of like what we call sort of the dumb phones that only allow for text messages and calls, right? So these type of technology is sort of going to be very attractive to try to reach people with information. But on the other hand, I guess, like, even if informational barriers might be important, I think there's, people have raised issues on whether these type of interventions are going to be effective, right? And so we might think that, look, just sending mass text to people, is a very top-down approach, is not necessarily going to address specific information needs of different people. People have pointed out that, look, text messages, it's quite restrictive. It's very hard to convey new information. Perhaps it could be used as nudges, but it's hard to sort of like create a program where like people are going to have to like be reading these messages and be making sense of them. So you might need a lot more intensive, like in person or phone calls to try to convey sort of like high quality information. And then there's this concern, right, that these type of programs might be very dependent on like who's sending the information, how exactly the information is designed, how much people sort of like trust that source, right? And there might be other sort of like issues with design, such as, to what extent if you keep texting people, for instance, or like they're just going to start ignoring these messages, or like effects might die over time. So we do have some evaluations on how effective sort of like these type of text message informations are, but so far, a lot of the qualitative expert reviews seem to suggest that, the effects are quite mixed, right? And this is sort of like in different areas, health and agriculture, for instance. It seems like if you do something like vote counting type analysis of studies, some of studies have null effects. Some studies do have positive effects. So this creates like a problem for policymakers, right? When we have sort of like this mix in the type of impacts that we can expect in a new setting, right? Because the more heterogeneity we think there is in treatment effects, then it's really hard to know whether this is going to extend, how is this going to behave in a new setting, right? So should we be like scaling up these types of programs? Or no, like it's just going to be very dependent on sort of like the context, on who's sending the messages, on the context of the messages. And so we need to keep evaluating, and it's going to be very dependent. We cannot generalize for these types of interventions. On the other hand, we also know that, you know, when we see sort of these types of mixed results, it could be because of different methodological considerations, right? So it's possible that the difference that we see in this heterogeneity, right, might be driven by sampling variation. It's possible that the studies that did not detect any significant impacts were simply, you know, they have very small sample sizes and we're underpowered to detect small effects. And we're just saying like, look, sort of like there's no impact from these studies. Or it's possible that the choice of instruments or indicators varies across projects, right? So we're measuring things at different points in time. We're actually getting sort of like different measures. Some people are measuring knowledge. Some people are actually sort of like measuring behavior change in different ways, et cetera.
Hey, Raissa, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So you motivated this with the fact that transmitting information is quite cheap, but you didn't mention how much it costs to generate the information. And I guess I was just wondering about your thoughts on, based on all of your work, the value of information to farmers relative, in terms of potential benefits, overcoming some information constraint relative to the cost of generating it.
Yeah, so that's a great point in terms of, you know, there's a cost, of course, of generating the information. And I think here we're thinking more about sort of like the marginal cost of transmitting the information. And that's sort of what we think is like very cheap. And there seems to be like a lot of organizations in developing countries and in developed countries, right, that actually spend a lot of time sort of generating this information. So we think of that sort of like last mile delivery problem, right? And like, how do you get sort of like this information to farmers? Now, I do take your point on sort of, you know, how valuable this information is to farmers. And for this particular paper, I am not going to take a stand. I can use sort of like the agronomic papers to try to say like, this is what I think the impacts are going to be sort of like on farmers' test plot of using that information. But it seems like there's many organizations, and sort of like I'll be talking about this, including the government, whose policy objective is for farmers to try to experiment with different types of inputs, right? So I'm just going to take that policy objective as given, right, and try to say like, how do we do that? I think you have a paper also on sort of like willingness to pay for soil information, is that right?
Yeah, I have some on soil testing, but there's always, I mean, even outside of agriculture, it's the idea of transmitting information. Like, I guess in that case, it's extremely costly to generate this information, right? Doing soil testing is highly costly and doesn't have the highest returns. But I was just thinking in general about like the policy sort of implications of what you were looking at and how that relates to the usefulness of the information that you're giving. But
these other papers that Julio mentioned on Netflix for agriculture, I think we were trying to make that point on like, look, you're not going to end up sort of like testing the soil of each particular farmer, but maybe if you do some area testing, right, that might be actually very cost effective. Okay, so let me tell you sort of like what we like after that motivation. Let me tell you a little bit of like what we want to do in this project. So this project is going to be sort of like very straightforward in what we're asking, right? We're going to sort of ask how effective are text message based information programs in affecting farmers' behavior, right? And by that I mean sort of like adopting sort of like these different inputs. We're going to have 6 experimental evaluations of text messaging programs in Kenya and Rwanda. And these programs, where you want to think of them as informational sort of like extension programs, right? So they're not sort of like nudges or just sort of reminders. They were really designed by each organization to try to convey new information. The second thing we're going to do is to aggregate the results of these 6 different RCTs through a meta-analysis, and that's because we want to increase statistical power, but also we want to learn a little bit about like how much impact heterogeneity there is across these different RCTs, right? So how much does it vary? Because that's going to tell us something, hopefully, about external validity. And then we're gonna, because we have these 6 different RCTs, we're gonna draw some lessons from each one of them because we have some treatment arm variation. So we're gonna, you know, learn about sort of like design features. So let me tell you where I see sort of like these projects contributing to what we know about digital interventions. So the first thing is that we had like variation in implementing partners. So we work with a social enterprise. We work with basically a public sector organization, and we work with this NGO. And each organization is going to like vary how they design their messages, how they targeted their users, and when they implemented the programs. You do not want to think of these as replications of the same program, right? You want to think of this as like the organizations have similar objectives, which was getting farmers to try these different inputs, and they're going to have similar tools, which is getting so like the text messages, but they're going to go about like crafting sort of like their own programs in their own individual ways, responding to their own constraints and opportunities. Okay. We're going to be experimenting with quite large sample sizes, and that's going to be key, right? Because cheap programs such as text messages could be very cost effective, even if we find very small impacts, right? And that's sort of like a point that we want to make about this literature, which, you know, in some of these papers have pretty like small sample sizes, and they might not be finding effects. But we think that for text messages, it's really important to be powered to try to find this. The second feature, like the third feature, is that we're going to try to measure behavior change through real input purchases, right? So there's sort of like this concern that in self-reports, people might perhaps over-report, you know, do you do what I told you to do? And people will say, yes, I did what you told me. So we were a little bit about sort of that type of social desirability bias. So we're gonna actually use administrative data and coupon data to try to see if they actually went to the store and bought these inputs. We're going to test for impact persistence of the text messages, how much message fatigue there is, a crowd out of other inputs, and whether there's spillovers on their text messages. So hopefully I'll sort of like get to talk a little bit about all of these things. And then we're going to have some lessons from some of the experiments on like framing, content, you know, what the impact of repeating the messages, and how much does it matter to have like some supplementary like phone call, for instance, when you actually talk to like a human in addition to having the text messages. Okay. So if there's no other questions, let me just tell you quickly about the context where we're working.
Can I just ask one more real quick?
Yeah.
What about, so I guess, what's the time period here?
So it's going to vary from 2014 to 2017.
Okay. Do you have any variation, or can you identify any variation in price of inputs that takes place over this period in the regions that you're looking at?
We do have some data on prices for Kenya, but I don't know exactly what you're thinking about.
No, I mean, in terms of either comparing the effect of information relative to prices of inputs as substitutes or as complements. I mean, to try to look at in terms of heterogeneity. I mean, it seems like it would be important.
Yeah, I mean, here's sort of like treatment and control will have like the same prices, but and I'll talk a little bit like how we measure, because sometimes we're gonna give people coupons to sort of like redeem sort of like the inputs, but then we can come back to sort of like this idea of prices. So maybe there's something else that we could be doing, and we do have like nice data for different parts of Kenya on prices, and maybe there's something else that we can do with that. Okay. So we're working with smallholder maize farmers. So these people have, on average, less than 1 acre of land. So you want to be thinking of them as people who are living on less than $2 a day, right? In Rwanda and Kenya, it's mostly rain-fed agriculture, very limited use of very modern agricultural technologies. I'll show you sort of like, actually, we find that most people have used fertilizers in the past, and might be using sort of like modern seeds, but there's no sort of irrigation or anything like that. I'm showing sort of like these two maps of Kenya and Rwanda on the areas where we worked. For Rwanda is basically the entire country. In Kenya is the western part of Kenya. And if you see on the different colors, that's telling you sort of the, what we estimate is the pH level of the soil based on local soil tests. And you see already sort of like there's a little bit of variation. And this is one of the reasons why sort of different organizations were excited about sort of using mobile phones to try to convey information, because then you can target better sort of what type of information you gave in a different region, right? So that was one of the reasons why sort of use mobile phones and not something else like a radio campaign, for instance. Okay, so there were 2 goals of the programs. 6 programs were very interested in getting farmers to adopt agricultural lime. Agricultural lime is this white powder that you apply in the soil and basically reduces soil acidity. There's been, agronomists sort of have done these like test plots. They estimate that, the rates of return to using agricultural lime are about 35 to 40%. Okay, so these like, perfect test plots. Whether you want to apply agricultural lime, it really depends on the acidity of your soil, right? So you don't want to apply a lime when your soil is not acidic. That's not going to make much of a difference. And this is an input that's not well known in these regions. So I'll show you sort of like numbers for baseline, but there was very low adoption of this type of technology. The 4 programs also send information about chemical fertilizers. Fertilizers are a well-known sort of like input. They're widely available for purchase, but most people are using planting fertilizers. And sort of there's other types of fertilizer that might be cheaper relative to the nitrogen content. And so there was this interest in like having farmers experiment with these other types of fertilizers that would be cheaper. Julia.
Thanks. I was just wondering, can you say something about the relative cost of applying these inputs? Just like, I don't know what lime is and like if it's much cheaper or expensive than fertilizers.
So agricultural lime is very, very cheap. It's just kind of bulky. So the problem with applying for many farmers is like, how do you transport to your farm? So that's why many of the programs, what end up doing was to recommend sort of like just putting it at the plant, say, instead of like broadcasting that would require like very big quantities. So everything at some point sort of like, I'll tell you more about the programs, but was thinking about like, these are smallholder farmers. So, they're going to end up purchasing like limited quantities of these inputs. And you'll see sort of like in the facts, when I talk about results, you'll see that, it's not going to be sort of transformational, sort of how much they can actually buy. All right. So we have these 3 programs implemented by 3 different organizations, as I said. One was the Kenya Agriculture and Livestock Research Organization. This is a public research organization that generates its knowledge, as sort of Jared was saying. They're partnered with the Ministry of Agriculture to provide extension services to workers. Then we, as researchers, we partner with Innovations for Poverty Action and Precision Agriculture for Development, which are sort of like non-for-profit research-oriented organizations that operate in Kenya. And then we had One Acre Fund. One Acre Fund is a social enterprise that works with hundreds of thousands of farmers in East Africa. And basically how they operate is that they form groups of farmers and they sell them inputs on credit, and then farmers repay those loans later in the season, right? And so I could write sort of a paper just in a case study of how each organization sort of had different constraints and sort of like how they went about sort of designing their own programs. But something that I want to highlight is, I think different organizations sort of respond very differently to incentives within the organization. So I wanted to give you an example of KALRO. KALRO, when we sort of like look at their messages, we realized they were very technical, right? So they would tell something to farmers like, if your soil is very acidic, pH less than 5.5, apply recommended rate of agricultural lime. That was one message, for instance. You might think like, well, farmers don't know if their soil is acidic, right? They, a soil test in their own land is like $10. They very rarely go for it. So, you might think like, look, it's going to be hard for farmers to react to this information if they're not sure sort of what's happening. When we talked to KALRO about it, they said like, look, we're the government, this has to be like very technically correct, for instance. if you look at the IPA messages, this is sort of like we came up, right? This is a joint initiative with researchers. Then we use sort of like soil information for the area. And so we would try to convey sort of like this uncertainty that the area, we think is like, highly acidic, right? And you might want to treat, and this is sort of like the amounts that you might want to use, for instance. And then if you see sort of the messages of the social enterprise, they're very direct, right? And sort of like they're telling people like your soil is acidic, sort of like buy sort of these types of inputs. So different organizations are going to go about sort of like designing their messages and contents in different ways. Okay, so I'm not going to go in details of how each program works, but let me just highlight what's different and what's similar across projects. So this is sort of like the list of the 6 programs that were implemented in Kenya, 5 of them, and Rwanda, the last one. As you see, sort of like they varied on in which season they were implemented. The other thing that varied was how people recruit or how organizations recruited farmers. So for instance, the KALRO program, the farmers came from village censuses, but the IPA programs, they would recruit them from their own database of people that had already participated in sort of NGO activities or from agro dealers. So that ended up with sort of like very different profiles of people. So for instance, people from the village census, there tend to be women, much poorer. People who were recruited that were clients of existing shops were mostly men and richer, right? So, that's going to vary. Then sort of like, again, because different organizations design the programs according to their own sort of objectives, sort of like the number of text messages is going to vary. So some programs like KALRO, there's like 20 text messages, for instance, from which 2 of them were about lime, 5 of them were about fertilizer, and the rest were like very general about like, work hard on your farm, apply these inputs, versus One Acre Fund, for instance, send like, 6 text messages all about lime, straight to the point, right? So that's going to vary a little bit. And then the last columns, I'm just showing sort of like the baseline use in the control group of these types of different inputs. So you see sort of like lime was not widely used. Most people have used, for instance, for KALRO, 83% of that sample had said they had used fertilizer. But then the types of fertilizers that were recommended by the program, there was like much lower usage. Okay, so that's in terms of what the programs are. Let me tell you a little bit like what the experimental evaluations of each programs are also. So the sample sizes are going to vary by program. So the first program by KALRO had like 800 farmers. The last program in Rwanda had like 110,000 farmers. Okay. Most experimental evaluations were randomized at the individual level, except for the one in Rwanda, which was randomized at the group level, sort of like these groups that One Acre Fund formed. And that's going to allow us to formally estimate spillovers, right? So that's going to be nice. Each experimental evaluation, sort of like in some of them, we have different randomization arms. And, I sort of want to reiterate, when we set out to do this project, we were not thinking we were going to aggregate sort of like these programs. So, we thought of them as independent sort of like evaluations. It just sort of like made sense for us to end up sort of like putting them together in a single paper. So, we tried different things for some of these programs. For instance, for IPA PID2 in Kenya, we tried sort of some treatment arms where we had sort of like phone calls for an extension officer. Some of the information, this general versus a specific information, for instance, refers to this idea that some treatment arms, we tried sort of like giving broad information about sort of like, the soil might be acidic, try sort of like using agricultural lime, versus specific information that would rely on soil test results for the area. Okay, so we sort of like tried to vary to what extent sort of like giving more specific information actually makes a difference. For the big One Acre Fund programs, where we actually have like much bigger sample sizes, then we could start having sort of like these cross randomizations, where we could try sort of like different framings, so behavioral framings, right? So try to sort of like self-efficacy or like what others are doing, etc. We randomized sort of like the number of messages that people were receiving, and so on. Okay, so let me tell you sort of like a couple of things about like measurement, because I think that's sort of like something where we spend a lot of time sort of like in terms of effort. So we're gonna have survey data for 4 programs, and sort of like baseline and endline data. And so that's gonna allow us to get some survey measures on knowledge and sort of like use of other inputs. But our preferred data for behavior change is gonna come from administrative data from purchases. And that's going to be very easy for like One Acre Fund, right? Because One Acre Fund directly sells inputs to farmers. And so we can just sort of like merge that data. It was a little bit more complicated to think about independent farmers, right? That could buy inputs from anywhere. So what we end up doing in that case was to give farmers in treatment and control groups discount coupons and try to measure redemption of these coupons that way, right? So what we did for the KALRO and IPA PID programs was to partner with over 100 of different shops in Western Kenya, where we asked the shops to keep sort of like logs of the purchases of people. And then these discount coupons had like a unique identifier. So we could see sort of like who's redeeming the coupon for what kind of input. Okay, so that's sort of like, we were very sort of like interested in having sort of like a real behavior measure of purchase. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So, I mean, so obviously One Acre Fund in these areas is going to be doing a lot of other programs like, I don't know, subsidized fertilizer and seed. Do you have any data on like these treatment villages and what other programs from One Acre Fund are going to be implemented in these areas? Or maybe what I'm thinking of happened later before your experimental period?
So there is some overlap, and we see, for instance, the independent farmers, some of them sort of like end up sort of being part of One Acre Fund program. So we asked them like, are you part of One Acre Fund? And if I remember correctly, that percentage is about 18%. So it is, and I'll talk to that about a little bit because I'm going to compare survey data with administrative purchase from these coupons, and you see that there's going to be a discrepancy. And so one explanation could be sort of like they're getting these inputs from somewhere else. So that's going to come back. Yeah. So, you know, in terms of like the estimation, so I'm going to show you, you know, for each individual experiment, we're going to, you know, there are RCTs, it's quite straightforward. We're going to run this as logistic regression. So I'm going to report to you results in terms of odds ratios. And, you know, for terms of the meta-analysis, I'm going to be pulling all treatment arms from a given study, right? And sort of, I'll show you at the end sort of what we learned from these different treatment arms from different studies. So that's in terms of each program. And then we're going to synthesize the program results in a meta-analysis, right? I'm going to be using these random effect models that basically assume that there's a distribution of true effects across settings, right? And what I'm showing you is sort of like this summary measure, which is sort of like this mean of sort of true effects, say. And I'm going to be also showing these tests of heterogeneity. So we can test for sort of like the null of homogeneity, right? That's sort of like of true impacts. And I'm going to show you sort of this I-squared index, which you want to think of it as the percentage of variance that's really attributable to study heterogeneity, right? So how much it's really heterogeneity in true impacts relative to just like sampling variation. We're going to do some Bayesian hierarchical analysis as a complementary approach, but the results are going to be sort of like very similar to frequentist methods. All right, so now let me sort of like jump into the results of like what we're finding. So this is just showing you, like, the first thing I want to show you is like, well, does it seem like these programs change knowledge about these different inputs? I only have sort of like 4 programs where we ask about, where we have survey data, and we could ask them like, you know, do you know strategies with soil acidity and different ways? And sort of like people, it was an open question, people could respond what they wanted. And so we were looking for whether people mentioned agricultural lime as a way to deal with like soil acidity. Here I'm showing you sort of these graphs are forest plots. Right, so each line is one different program and the corresponding coefficient and confidence interval. And, you know, just as a reminder of odds ratios and how they work, you know, if it's 1, basically there's no impact, right? And so above 1, so we're, it's like a positive impact of the treatment. So we find sort of like a positive effect across programs on sort of like knowledge measures, which is very much in line of the literature. Like I think sort of like these digital interventions have been shown to sort of like affect knowledge is more of a question of like how much does that knowledge translate into behavior change. In terms of, you know, I want to translate because I know odds ratios are not sort of like, I don't perhaps top of mind for people, but this corresponds to about like an 8 percentage point increase in knowledge. Okay, so this is sort of like what I would think maybe perhaps the main result, right? So these are like line purchases from the 6 different programs, right? And we see sort of like an increase in the odds of like 22%. So that corresponds to about like 2 percentage point increase in the purchase of agricultural lime. So like modest effects, right? But they seem to be there. And also like what I want to point out is like, first, we cannot reject the null of homogeneous treatment effects, right? If you sort of like look at the I-squared, that's telling you that about 70% of the variation we think is coming from sampling variation, right? So it seems like, you know, I would think that there's low sort of like variation, like true impact of these projects. But if we had seen sort of like these projects independently, right, like 2 of them have not significant effects. Okay, so this is sort of like line purchases for current sort of concurrent implementation of the program. Fertilizer purchases, this is sort of like a better known technology, even those are like these fertilizers, some of them people had not used. We find sort of like similar impacts, about sort of like 2 percentage point in the use, in the purchase of the recommended fertilizers. Again, we cannot reject the null of homogeneous treatment effects, right, across these programs, which sort of like tells you hopefully something about the external validity of these types of interventions. Okay. So the reason we decided to go sort of with administrative data instead of self-reported data, and that maybe this is sort of like more of a methodological contribution, is that we do find sort of like differences in how people report from surveys relative to sort of like the purchases, right? So this is giving you sort of like the difference in reports, and you can see sort of like that is significant for lime, is not significant for fertilizer, but it's also not very consistent, right? Because it's sort of like for fertilizer, it seems like they're underreport, for limes, they seem to be over-reporting. So this goes back a little bit to sort of like what Jared was saying, right? Because it seems that people are saying that they're using more lime when we ask them in the survey than what we see in the sort of like coupon and administrative data. Now, I cannot, you know, conclusively say this is misreporting, in part because people might have gone and purchased inputs from other places that were not where we sort of like measure sort of like our coupons, right? Or like maybe they did not buy from One Acre Fund, they bought from somewhere else. So that's one possibility. However, we did ask people sort of like, where do you get sort of like your agricultural lime? You know, if they said sort of they got it, and about 65% said they got it from a shop that our own records say they did not stock agricultural lime from that time period. So, you know, that sort of like suggests to me that one needs to be pretty cautious when using self-reported data, even for behavior that is not particularly sensitive. Yeah, Julia.
So I need to go back to like the one before, but I'm just wondering about like when you say it's a 2%, like 2 percentage point increase, what that would translate to in terms of agricultural outputs, and then, you know, like basically improvements in income and living conditions for these farmers.
Yes, so let me get back to that at the end when I talk very quickly about like cost effectiveness, because then I'm gonna use the back of the envelope calculations to try to say like, you know, should be doing, is it worth it for a 2% increase?
Right, thanks.
All right. So something that perhaps is nice is that we do not see crowd out of non-recommended inputs. So for each program, sort of like we ask them whether they're using other things like, you know, improved seeds, sort of like other practices. And that's sort of like a very like well estimated zero, right? So it doesn't seem like because you're now purchasing lime, then you're going to stop sort of like doing something else that you were doing that would perhaps sort of like, you know, we would not account for that when we were thinking about like what are the impacts overall in terms of like productivity. Okay, so in terms of how persistent sort of like these interventions are, so something that we could do in 4 of the projects is measure adoption for a second season, once sort of like the first season, once the program had ended in the first season. And we do see that there's decay on the impacts of these projects. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. So one question is, so this store, so these people is usually go to this store or just when you send these messages?
No, so for
this store is where people go and buy many different things for, I don't know, for the week, for the month. And,
exactly.
And one of the things, but the store has this product already. It was not that you introduce it in the store. So because what I am trying to is, I understand that, so basically you are evaluating whether these people knew or not about the properties of this product, and well, this could be a good strategy for them to start using. But one question is why the store was not offering this product to these people when they go. So why the store has no incentive to try to sell this product if they have it in the store? So
yeah, so that's a great question. So first, the stores, you know, you want to think of like there's a little village and then there's a market center, and in each market center there's like a store that sells inputs. So this was a regular store. That's where people go get their seeds, all their other things. So there's nothing weird about these stores. I think, you know, for fertilizers, these stores were like stocking all these different kinds of fertilizers. For lime is like a new input, sort of like in the region. And it's kind of like a weird situation because if you ask the store, like, why are you not stocking? So first of all, let me say, we made sure that the stores were stocked with the inputs for the redemption of these things, because we were interested in like, do people go and get this, right? So if there was no input, we were not going to like answer that question.
But you didn't affect the stock, or you did? Of the store.
So for some projects, so for 1 Acre Fund, they had their own inputs. For KALRO, the government had introduced sort of these inputs in these regions. For PID, we sort of like made sure that the stores sort of like had these in stock. Now, when you ask the store, like, why are you not sort of like stocking these things? Or the stores sort of say like, well, people do not demand them, right? And so sometimes you ask like to people, why are you not going and getting this thing? And they're like, well, it's hard to like find in the store. So, you know, there's a lot of like frictions, I think, in terms of like how these stores actually work and their price. So we could have a whole other conversation about sort of like these little stores, because I think that's also fascinating what's going on there.
Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of
one quick thing, in this time period, in terms of the coupons, there are or aren't coupons in this period, in the T+1?
T+1, yeah. So they receive a second coupon.
Okay.
So we're measuring sort of redemption, either purchases in 1 Acre Fund in a second period once the program had ended, or coupon redemption once the program had ended in a second period, right? So we're measuring basically how much does this persist over the next season if you do not retreat the farmers. And that's where we see sort of like there's decay of these programs. But here's where I think it's interesting, because if you retreat the farmers, right? So we have like 3 programs where we treat them for 2 seasons. and we measure like the 2 season redemption. So we're measuring here redemption at T+1. We see sort of that the programs like stay. Okay, so to me, this seems to indicate that this is not, the channel through which this is working is not just information, but there seems to be some sort of like behavioral or like salience channel that's sort of like making people, because if we think like it's just information, then once they have the information, they should sort of like go with it, or, not go with it because they realize this was, they tried the input, they did not like it. But it seems weird that if you retreat them, then sort of like you get sort of like similar impacts. So that's in terms of message fatigue. And so this is something that people were worried about, that if you keep retreating like farmers, farmers were going to get annoyed and like stop doing the things. Actually, that's not what we find. We find sort of like that sort of like seems to be better. Okay, so just to recap, there seems to be knowledge gains, increases in the probability of following recommendations. For most part, we reject the null of sort of like homogeneous treatment effects. So it seems like the true impacts are pretty similar. But we do find differences between self-reports and administrative data, and no evidence of like message fatigue. Okay, so I think I have like 15 minutes. So let me tell you some additional things, some additional lessons that we learned from each experiment, given that we have sort of like different treatment arms for each experiment. So let me tell you about like what happens with framing and content, repetition of messages, when you complement these with a phone call, and how much we think there's spillovers. Okay, so here's what we sort of learned about like framing and content. So as I said, for the PID programs, for PID1, sort of we had sort of like general messages or specific messages where we gave them information based on soil tests for their area. 1 Acre Fund also sort of like gave them broad messages or very detailed messages where they sort of like told people exactly how much to use, sort of like what effects in terms of yields they sort of like they estimated they could expect. And then for 1 Acre Fund, they tried to do all these different types of behavioral interventions where sort of like, they relied on self-efficacy, social comparisons, like, frame as a gain, frame as a loss, all these different things. And basically, we do not find significant difference across any of these different variations of messages, which, on the one hand, sort of, I think, our prior was like these behavioral messages, some of them were going to be way more effective than others. So, maybe that's not great. But on the other hand, I think like there was this concern that how you design your message specifically is going to be very important. But it seems like, these messages as effective. Now, I don't want to say that, there's no difference at all, because maybe if we had sort of like larger sample sizes, we would have been like able to like pick these things up. So maybe this is still sort of like an area where it might be sort of like be worth sort of like really fine tuning things, especially because it's just so cheap to sort of like change the wording to really optimize things. But in general, it doesn't seem to matter whether we told people, we did all these things where like we spent so much time trying to think about like the local soil information and how to convey it and like, etc. And that did not seem to matter for like behavior change. Okay. In terms of how much does additional like phone calls matter, like really talking to someone, and that's something that we, when we were talking to the government and sort of like others, they were like, look, text messages, they're cheap, but there's nothing like talking to a person. If the farmer cannot talk to the extension worker and really ask and like clarify things, this is not going to be very effective. We don't find a difference from text messages for versus text messages with a call or like an offer of giving them a call, right? And we actually find very low demand for the treatment arm where like there was a call offer. Only about like 18% of farmers actually sort of like decided to like get a call from extension. And, I think we found this surprising, but since then we found sort of like other meta-analysis of literature in like health digital interventions, and they seem to sort of like suggest similar things where like these additional components do not necessarily like add much. All right. What seemed to be sort of like mildly effective was to repeat the same message at least more than once. So one message, not as effective, but if you send at least 2 messages, that's sort of like when you start sort of like seeing the effects, and then sort of like it plateaus. So it doesn't matter if you send sort of like more than 2. Okay, so repetition, sort of like the people doing marketing, sort of like they're onto something, I think. All right. In terms of spillovers, so as I said, we had these 1 acre.
One quick question.
Yeah.
Sorry, on the timing. So like if they send multiple messages, is it more likely that those messages are going to be received at times when they're making decisions to purchase, or are these all going to be within weeks or days of when they would actually
So for the 1 acre fund repetition, how they work is that they were sent sort of like within 1 week of the 5 messages, right? Because it was before sort of like they were going to hit sort of like the decision to buy sort of like these different inputs.
So that seems effective.
Yeah, so for the PID, sort of like they were more over the, the entire period, but we did not randomize sort of like the repetition, but we did repeat it over time because we thought that would be important. Okay. So we tried to measure spillovers for the 1 acre fund groups. And I want to sort of like highlight that here we do expect sort of spillovers because people work in groups. So we were thinking like they're talks. So it's going to be a little bit different from farmers where we randomize at the individual level, where it's sort of like they're in the village and they're not necessarily interacting all that much. But from the Rwanda experiment, we can exploit that 2-level randomization, sort of like the within group and between group. And we find that, the effect, the magnitude of these spillovers is about 1/3 of the main impact. So there seems to be that if you don't account for spillovers, you're also going to underestimate a little bit sort of like the impacts of these types of programs. And this is sort of like, we could do it for like comparing sort of like partial control versus full controls. We could also do it, many people in Rwanda do not have sort of like a cell phone yet. So we could also see sort of like spillovers to them, and those seem to be positive. Okay. Not going to show you this, but we do not find much in terms of subgroup heterogeneity, which was also a little bit like surprising for us, especially in terms of baseline knowledge of these different inputs, which again sort of like suggests to me that maybe this is working more through salience than necessarily through information changes. Okay. All right, so this goes back a little bit to like Julia's point of like, well, 2 percentage points, sort of like this is not transformational for these farmers. And I think ideally what we would have done is just to get sort of like profit data from these farmers, right? But I want to convey that sort of like these are going to be like very small changes, and actually measuring yields at this scale, I don't think we would have been able to in terms of like budget or like setting up an RCT of that kind, in part because yields are so noisy and it's just so hard to get power to measure that kind of thing. So we're going to sort of like take a different approach and do 2 things. One is, let's use agronomic data to try to figure out, like based on a meta-analysis of, for instance, like agricultural lime and sort of like test plots, let's try to calculate, right, what's the return of using agricultural lime, and sort of like use that as a way to estimate how, what's going to be sort of like the change in terms of profits for these farmers. And we find sort of like small effects on sort of like farmers. So let me go a little bit into the details of this, because it just gets to sort of like Julia's point. But on average, the program is increasing sort of the quantity on lime of like 1 kg, right? And that's sort of like, we think sort of like that translates into sort of like about 2 additional kgs of like maize, sort of like for each farmer, which is less than like $1 in terms of revenue, right? But I think sort of like what, like way we want to think about this calculation is also like relative to the cost of the text message, right? So less than $1 doesn't seem like very transformational or sort of like that important for the income of these farmers. But if you compare sort of like how much a text message, the marginal cost of that text message is like cents on the dollar, like much lower. So we, as we implemented, we estimate that the benefit cost ratio is about 9:1, right? If you implement this on a much larger scale where you're using sort of like these bulk pricing, then it's like 90:1. Okay, so not huge effects. So I don't want to claim like, texting people is going to change their lives. But if you're sort of like making the decision, should we actually send these messages or not? It does seem sort of like cost effective as an intervention. I also want to, so the second thing we do is to compare this to what the governments and other people are doing to try to get farmers to experiment with these types of inputs, right? So we have another paper where sort of we evaluated the traditional approach of what the government is doing to get farmers to try agricultural land. And that's sort of like field days where sort of like these are very large in-person meetings where sort of like, they explain sort of what agricultural lime is, there's groups of farmers, they spend the entire day. Now, we estimate that program in this region increased the adoption of lime by 4 percentage points, right? So not a huge difference relative to the 2 percentage points of the text messages. And we calculate that the cost there was like about $45 per adopting farmer. Relative to our text messages, that could be about like $1.50 per adopting farmer, or 15 cents when you implement these at scale, right? So very different in terms of prices. So I guess the point what I would make is like, this is a given that the government is going to be doing this type of intervention. It's much cheaper to do it via text message than what the government is currently doing, which is sort of like getting everyone to sort of like attend these in person and sort of spending things that way. We also compared this to another program by One Acre Fund, where they gave basically incentives. And maybe this goes back to like Julio's point of like, what if we just incentivize the seller to do this thing? And that was about like $2 per adopting farmer for sort of like using lime. Okay, so it seems that, if your goal is to get farmers to experiment with these things, you might as well sort of like go with these types of like low cost interventions. Okay, so just to conclude, we do see these increases in lime and fertilizer. Again, modest impacts in absolute value, and sort of like relative to the literature that I've been reading on these text message programs, like I think is very in line with the magnitudes that we see sort of like in other types of interventions. So that range of like 2 to 4 percentage points. But something that is nice about this project is that because we have this huge sample size, we really can detect sort of like those effects that would still be like cost effective if implemented. Where we find sort of like repetition is valuable, adding these costly components, not necessarily so. And we find less heterogeneity than what's suggested, right? But the existing sort of like qualitative review of the literature that are just doing this vote counting on like null effects versus positive effects and trying to summarize the data that way. And I think, some of these lessons might sort of like go beyond agriculture. I think there's a lot of people working for like educational text messages or like governance. And I think sort of like really thinking about methodological choices like, sample size, how are you going to measure behavior might be actually pretty important for all those kinds of interventions. And that's all I have. So I don't know if there's other questions.
Thank you so much, Raissa. It was a great presentation. I have one question. So one thing is, this is a cheap way of reaching people. Now, do you have a sense of how many messages these farmers were already receiving from other organizations and other, I don't know, perhaps commercial ones? Because one thing is, what I see is that there are a lot of papers that conclude that the policy recommendation is providing information. So then suppose that we implement all these recommendations and we send information to the people using the text message that is relatively cheap. So the question is, well, how effective is this going to be? Does commercial company, for-profit company, use this way as a way of reaching people on trying to sell their product. So again, my point is that I understand it's very cheap, but if you send tons of messages per day, then I don't know, perhaps the tool will not be useful anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something I worried about too. In this particular context, so we asked people sort of baseline whether they were subscribing different things, and they were not. And sort of like, maybe it's sort of like that matters for this type of impact. I think I think we have some evidence, for instance, on the fatigue front, that sort of like that seemed to sort of like maintain. And maybe that was not my prior. I thought like, look, once you start texting people, maybe they're going to be annoyed. But I absolutely think that you're right, that say like, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Agriculture and Health, and all of these people are sending you messages. At some point, sort of like we also know from all these other sort of behavioral literature that, you have some bandwidth and how much you can pay attention to that. And that's something that maybe at some point we need to start thinking about, like, how are you going to coordinate? And maybe you need some central sort of like organization, right, in the government to figure out how do we coordinate all these types of messages. And I don't have a ton to say about sort of like what will happen, right, once you have sort of like this overload of different information.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions.
Yeah, just one more quick question is like, so if these act as kind of like reminders to increase the salience of purchasing these things, do you think, I mean, not from any survey, I doubt you have survey evidence on it, but like, do you think that farmers demand this sort of information? Like, do you think that they would have some sort of willingness to pay for receiving these at optimal times?
That's a great question. So one thing we know is that farmers had to opt in our projects, right? Because sort of like you cannot force them to receive these things, and everyone was like, we had no problem with getting people to sort of like opt in. So we think sort of like there's demand for that kind of thing. We did have another project where we elicited willingness to pay for soil test information, and we think it was relatively high relative to what we were expecting. So there seems to be that people sort of like seem to be craving information for this thing. Now, we did not try sort of like selling this, and I don't know if we would want to like sell this information, in part because that would limit access, and we think actually the returns are going to be higher as a public good. But yeah, I don't have sort of like numbers for that, but I can tell you that like people really wanted to be part of these programs and sign up for these programs.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you so much again for the great presentation, and well, thank you everybody for being here today. So on December 10, we will have Nicholas Axelman from Sao Paulo School of Economics at the JiLAEE seminar. He will present a paper about altruism or money, reducing teacher sorting using behavioral strategies in Peru. So, well, I hope to have you all there on December 10. And well, thank you again, Raissa, and thank you everybody for being here, and well, have a great weekend.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you so much. Talk to you in a bit.
Great. Bye, everyone.